Hello, everybody. Brady, aka the War Hamster, here. Joining me today is from the Colonel's Corner, Colonel Towner-Watkins. How are you today?
Great. How are you?
I'm doing great. Excited to do this show. This is the third of a series that we've been working on, all tied around Operation Gladio. First one was we titled in my Shadow State series, Operation Gladio. Our second video that we did was I called it the Shadow State. What did I call it? Oh, it was about the Robert Maxwell story, the father of the famous Ghislaine Maxwell. And that actually ended up being the most viewed video I've ever had on my channel in just a matter
That's
of 2 or
awesome.
3 weeks. Yeah, that one went great. Um, anyways, Colonel, can you tell my audience who you are and why I have you on here?
I'm Colonel Roxanne Towner-Watkins, and I spent 30 years in the military. And I have, over the last year, I have done a very deep dive into what was new to me at the time, Operation Gladio, and the details of how what a spider octopus kind of operation it is for almost no one in the United States to have ever heard about it. It's a global organization. It's very well known outside of the United States, and I've had a thrill bringing it both in book review form to my Rumble channel, writing about it on my Substack channel, and doing videos with Warhamster.
And others. You've been making the rounds a little bit.
I have. I just appeared on the second, it's not out yet, with Alpha Warrior, who is a cop who got caught up in the January 6th BS. And what an amazing story he has. And he's got an amazing program. And I've been on the last two Monday night versions of The Pawn on Spaces on X. And that's my first real audience interactive presentation of Gladio. It's been a learning experience for me as to what excites people, what interests people, and the various background of the people involved. I have always wanted to do a forum where I could interact with the people that I do a presentation with, and that is a fabulous forum to do that in.
Great. Yeah, and for those of us who know me from my very early days, that's the same Alpha Warrior I made my video debut with on the old Glitch in the Matrix. And it's good to see he's doing well. And yeah, I actually made a couple of live appearances lately myself. Gordon, aka Ghost of Patrick Henry, and Matthew Arrett had me on Badlands Media to talk about some of the banana fruit stuff. The Banana Republic and United Fruits, portion of Gladio, etc., and actually predates Gladio. And I was also on TNT Radio with Matt Arrett. I think it was just last weekend, and that was a lot of fun. Matt's a great historian, and he's never runs out of good topics to talk about. So hopefully I get to do that again.
Well, actually, a lot of the United Fruit is part of Gladio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really well, but I would say Gladio was almost the first time it was really formalized. Before that, they were doing the same kind of shenanigans, but they didn't have the actual
Correct.
official infrastructure in place.
Correct. After 1947, when they stood up NATO and the CIA, it brought in-house all of the activities that had happened outside of the house prior to that.
even though there's a lot of the same actors,
100% overlap on the actors.
Yeah, they were doing it privately at one point, and then they just became government sanctioned.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit more about the private stuff. So, give us a good, overview of what is Gladio, and why are we? What's the angle we're going to hit on today?
So, Operation Gladio, the easiest way to characterize Gladio from a 30,000 foot is it's to generate chaos in any manner necessary, to include assassinations, to control populations. That's it in a nutshell. Chaos and control. And it is to achieve all mechanisms of power, both economic, political, and military. So they will use, down at the tactical level, these 15 to 20 man cells to effect domestic terror events to control the population. And in some cases, they use selected people that are well trained in assassinations to knock off entire governments and overthrow the government. So they operate at all spectrums, strategic, operational, and tactical level, using tactical level entities to effect chaos so they can control. So that's kind of a broad overview of it, but there's many aspects to it. Today, we're going to talk about economic and legal aspects to affect that same scenario. But there is always a paramilitary tactical level capability in case the legal and the economic falls short.
Yeah, and the overarching goal, of course, is not just geopolitical control, moving the chess pieces, but it's also for economic dominance. The people behind all
Yeah, I
this.
refer to that as control, but yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess that's a good point. You get at the top of the food chain here. You got these, who are the people calling the shots, and it's these multinational corporations, and they think they're bigger than governments. And we're going to talk a little bit about how they've used legal mechanisms to actually give themselves more power than sovereign nation states in many ways. So,
And if you look at the whole geophysical sphere of the globe, that is exactly what happens. You have industrialists, I call them the international syndicate, and they are the ones directing the calls, because the only reason that you would want to destabilize a country, and using like Guatemala is a great example, they go in and they destabilize so they can go in and take the resources. They buy companies. If there's any national companies in there, or international, former international companies, they will buy them pennies on the dollar. They will dominate them. If you have natural resources, if you have gold, if you have silver, they're going to take those. So it's all to benefit the overlords or the international syndicate. They just use these networks to do it.
yeah, absolutely. So jumping in, the first topic here is something called the ISDS, which is an investor state dispute settlement. So ISDS is the acronym. We're going to be talking about that for a few minutes. The background's interesting. Coming out of World War II, one of the things you saw geopolitically was a lot of the former British colonies and other European colonies were getting their independence for the first time. They were trying to prop up their own quote unquote democracies. And I put the air quotes there for a reason. We saw a pattern emerging in the 1950s. In 1953, the CIA and MI6 took out Mossad of Iran. And that was all about British Petroleum Company. In 1954, the CIA took out the president of Guatemala because he was trying to redistribute land back to the peasants. And that was a United Fruit Company orchestrated coup. In 1956, President Nasser of Egypt was trying to nationalize the Suez Canal, which prompted a invasion by France, the UK, and Israel. So this is a pattern, in the early 1950s. And there's a German banker, old Nazi banker named Hermann Abs, and he made a famous speech in San Francisco in 1957 called the Capitalist Magna Carta. And he basically said, we're going to keep running into this problem. So we need a legal system in place where we can exercise power above these local elected leaders. So we need a supranational institution where investor rights can be enforced. So Abs joins with a British guy by the name of Lord Shawcross, and they created the Abs-Shawcross Draft Convention and a entity called ICSID. And ICSID, this is 1956. ICSID starts in 1966, so it took them a decade to put this in place. ICSID is I have that right here, International Center for Development of Investment Disputes. It sounds rather innocent, but the devil's in the details. What is the ISDS? What they basically did is they created a global Supreme Court. It's a shadow legal system, and it operates across the world, and it enshrines a system where multinational corporations can sue nation states. It's an arm of the World Bank. So all these countries that are coming out of the cold and joining the rules-based, transatlantic rules-based orders, which we call the Anglo-American banking system that controls the world. If you want to join into this program, you've got to sign all these trade deals. And buried in all these trade deals, hundreds of pages of legality, are these ISDS agreements. So your country's not going to be able to get IMF loans. You're not going to be able to get World Bank loans or any of that, and you're not going to be able to participate in the dollar-based economic system unless you agree to these trade deals. I'll pause right there for your comment.
A couple of things. The coups that you all mentioned, Iran, Guatemala, all Operation Gladio induced because of exactly what you said. You had an independent leader rise up after the institutionalization of Gladio via NATO and the CIA, because independence is not allowed. And they went into Iran, Guatemala, and they overthrew the government for their overlords. That's the whole purpose of Operation Gladio. So, and it's great that you picked those. I didn't even realize those were the ones you were going to highlight, because they were all, and I've got the sauce on all of that, all Operation Gladio and who actually committed them. So that's very interesting. The kind of mind meld on how this whole thing unfolds. And like you said, that's exactly the reason why. Well, if you, in military operations or strategic, you want to avoid kinetic at all possible if you can do it through the other power means, legal and economic. But you always have the backup of the paramilitary forces when needed. So proceed on.
Okay. So a little more detail about how these ISDSs work. It's basically where corporate lobbyists and lawyers come in. You get these 400-page legal documents for the corporations to have free reign in foreign countries. These agreements are enshrined in deals like NAFTA, CAFCA. It would have been all over the TTIP agreement. That was a Trans-Pacific Partnership that Trump basically nixed. And if you want to know, you saw this syndicate go after Trump's presidency unlike anything we've ever seen. A lot of it has to do with the fact that he was rewriting these trade deals, and there were trillions of dollars at stake.
Exactly.
So what'll happen is a corporation will, let's say there's a country down in, let's say it's, Guatemala, for example, and they decide that these mining operations are being harmful to their people. So they want to put some, environmental regulations in there. Don't poison the local people when you're mining. Well, the mining company can be from anywhere, because say it's from the United States, will basically be able to sue the government officials in that country, in the host country, and say, well, the investors in our company stand to lose a lot of money, and we're going to sue you to have our investors made whole. And what it does is it effectively handcuffs local sovereign leaders in our own countries from being able to make laws. They actually do not have the ability. They have to check it through the corporate lawyers before they can pass bills and protect their own country or work in their country's own interests. And that's very destabilizing. The mechanism where it works in these free trade agreements is, you'll have international lawyers, or I'm sorry, it'll be settled in an international court. A lot of times these countries don't even know what they're getting into. They're unsophisticated. And you basically get everything settled by a system of arbitrators. But the way the arbitrators are chosen is opaque, and we have no idea how the arbitrators are compensated. You can do jurisdiction shopping. One of my favorite examples was there was a company in California where some California environmental regulations were going to hurt their investors' potential profits. But it's an American company, and this is about international companies. So what this American company did is they opened up a shell corporation up in Canada and then sued California under the ISDS, and they got like $30 million of California taxpayer money because there's another fun little angle of this, because anytime you're talking about international finance, you're going to get the banks involved. There are specialized boutique investment firms who their only way they make money, their entire investment strategy is to make claims against other nations on the behalf of multinational corporations. And they'll even lend money for a company to sue and just to take a cut of the profits. And sometimes it's billions in rewards. Occidental Petroleum got $1 billion from Ecuador. Right now, currently, and I don't think it has been settled, there's a U.S. company suing Honduras for $11 billion, which is basically 1/3 of the Honduran GDP. And there's no way Honduras can pay that. What does the Honduran government have to do? If they want to remain part of the global financial system, they've got to play ball. So if they lose this, and they're fighting hard, brings up an interesting Interesting. I'll give you some more examples of this first. Um, like I said, this whole mechanism went into place in 1966, but it didn't really take off until after the Cold War. And you had all these former Soviet bloc countries coming out of the cold and joining the Western financial system. And that's when all these cases started to be brought. And since then, there's been like 3,000 of these cases brought. Um, some of the best examples. So I can grab you a few of them. Oh, so people in America have never heard of an ISDS, and there's a reason for that. It's just not talked about. But you go to a country like El Salvador, and every single person knows about it because the government fought back. There's an activist named Marcelo Rivera who ended up being tortured and murdered in 2009. The government tried to protect and pull a permit from a mining company, and the mining company sued the ISDS for $300 million. Government fights back, and everybody in El Salvador knows about this stuff because the government fight back. The reverse of that is in South Africa. When the ANC government took power, one of the things they wanted to do was they created a policy that said 30% of all companies operating in South Africa have to be owned by quote unquote, previously oppressed minorities. Yeah, it's redistribution. I'm not going to make a comment on that. I think it's socialism, but they do have the ability to do that in their own country. So there's a bunch of Italian granite miners. They took them to an international court. And instead of fighting it, the government settled out of court and caved. And they did this so that other companies operating in South Africa wouldn't do the same and sue. So just the blackmail and the leverage over the government is pretty immense. And of course, there's the famous in Colombia, how Chiquita, formerly known as United Fruit, they were taken to court in the U.S. versus the Alien Tort Statute because they had hired paramilitary groups to go after activists.
Not Gladio.
Oh, never. There's a nonprofit group called Public Citizen that does a lot of work on this and tracking. And I'm just going to read a couple quotes from them, and I'll turn it over to you. You're basically you're allowed to allows multinational corporations to sue governments before a panel of 3 corporate lawyers. These lawyers can award the corporation unlimited sums to be paid by taxpayers, including the loss for expected future profits that the attorneys surmise the corporations would have earned if not for the challenged policy. Does it get more opaque than that?
Nope.
The corporations need only convince the lawyers that a law, safety regulation, court ruling, or other government action violates the investor rights that an agreement enforced by an ISDS grants them. So an investor has more power than the sovereign seat of government. These lawyers' decisions are not subject to appeal, and only corporations have rights and can initiate ISDS cases. ISDS tribunals often make countries pay for tribunal costs even when dismissing corporate attacks, so the mere threat of a case has a chilling effect. By elevating individual corporations to the same status as sovereign governments, ISDS drastically consolidates and formalizes corporate power. And by effectively providing free risk insurance, these corporate protections make it less risky and cheaper to outsource jobs. And from the U.S. Trade Representative, over the last 50 years, there have been nearly 3,200 trade and investment agreements among 180 countries and have included investment provisions, and the vast majority of these agreements have included some form of ISDS. It's it's funny. It's been a stealth way of exercising immense power across sovereign nations all over the world, and it's scary. You start looking at what President Trump did with the Mexico-Canada-America trade agreement as opposed to NAFTA, and you'll notice these ISDSs are largely absent. And I think that's one of the major reasons that certain interests have spent quite a bit of time and effort trying to make sure he never gets back into office.
So let me jump in here because you highlighted so many things. First of all, this benefits the elite. This is not normal companies getting a perk. These are large global conglomerates. that take advantage of this. That's number one. Number two, when you have companies like Rio Tinto, who has gone into countries and completely destroyed the integrity of the infrastructure and the natural resources due to mining, and they are basically, as you just pointed out, exempt. You cannot, after the fact, implement, because in some cases, like in Australia, what they did there was just unbelievable to the natural aesthetics of the land. And you can't imagine such irresponsibility in a company that you would even have to legislate the fact that you can't contaminate the local drinking water, which is what they did. And so then when Australia tries to take action that addresses the horrific destruction that they're wrecking in the local area, they get hit with these types of actions. And so what, again, I'm a concept person. And so when you were reading that, those boutique firms that you were talking about, the big boutique firms, they're like the Morgan and Morgan of the international, right? They pay for everything up front to represent you because they're going to get a big cut on the back end. That's literally what I thought of when you were discussing that.
Well, it's funny that more people don't know about it, know about this. I mean, this should be headline news, but the reason it's not is the corporations hide behind NGOs, non-government organizations.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
So the corporations go in and they give the appearance of altruism that they hide behind the NGOs. That's how they get, that's all the stuff you saw in the Amazon forest, was about a land grab. It had nothing to do with protecting the Amazon, very little.
Correct.
And a lot of it's, they basically support policies that promote corporate rule. One of the major backers of this is the World Bank, and the World Bank's supposed to be an aid institution, and it created in 1956 something called the IFC, which is the International Finance Corporation. It was all about it's part of the decolonization movement, and air quotes again on decolonization, because I would call it recolonization.
It 100% is.
Okay. So what is the IFC? IFC is an investment bank. It finances private corporations like diamond mines and five-star hotels and third world companies with public money. That's taxpayer money is being used. When U.S. tax dollars go to the World Bank, they're basically turning around, financing the build out of a big project in a third world country or even second world country for U.S. corporations or multinational corporations. And it's funny because the World Bank, their stated aim, the reason for existing, is the elimination of poverty, and they accomplish just the opposite.
So let me go one step further with the World Bank, because this is a big element to Operation Gladio. So we found in our research in Operation Gladio that they love taking World Bank loans that are provided to local countries for things that you were just outlining. And in Africa, talking about both the decolonization versus recolonization, what they were leveraging the World Bank loans for is they gave them outrageous loans that they knew could never be paid back. Then the international syndicate, as I refer to them, the cluster of industrialists, they wanted the preservations, conservation territory in some of these large landmass countries in Africa. And they would go in and pressure the government to exchange these, the land in repayment for the loan. Then what they were doing with this land is they were creating Operation Gladio training facilities to include bomb assassination, all kinds of terroristic training camps on these confiscated lands that they traded in World Bank loans for. And they were using the local population as live targets. They would have entire villages massacred surrounding these Operation Gladio land preserve training bases because they were using the local population as live targets.
Yeah, and in Central America, it's one of the things I talked about when I talk about United Fruit Company, is one of the things they did to build out their banana empire is they bought up all sorts of unused land. And they own vast, I think, I forget the number of acres, but it was a ridiculous amount of acreage and all throughout Central America at one point. And, where do you think that all these paramilitary and CIA groups staged their headquarters? It was on
They
United.
own 42% of Guatemala.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. And I think across the area was something like I want to say it was 3 million acres. I think that's the right number that I had, but it's obscene amount. And of course, they get all kinds of tax breaks from their companies. Uh,
And you have to keep in mind, let me just, when you looked at the board directors of United Fruit at the time, it was a CIA front company. However, there were the Rockefellers was one of the board directors at the time. 2 CIA agents was board directors at the time. And like 3 other industrialists, they owned 42% of Guatemala, and they paid 0 taxes in Guatemala.
And you wonder why we have the Guatemalan refugee problem coming to across the border of the United States.
Yeah, exactly.
These what do they call, what's the proper term for it? It's a multilateral development bank. Another great acronym. These people are all about acronyms. MDBs. They've been criticized for a long time for trapping these developing nations in debt and then using that debt to force those nations to deregulate markets. So when you hear somebody talk about deregulating trade or free trade deals, it's just the opposite. There's a great quote I'd like to share that describes this. It also describes stakeholder capitalism. It is essentially a creative way of marketing corporatism, the definition of fascism infamously supplied by Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. So if that makes sense, this is basically international fascism. Oh, your mic. Yeah, there you go.
That was funny because that quote is at the top of one of the chapters in one of my Gladio books. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah, it is. This is basically international fascism. And those of us who oppose it and want to have, here in America, we're trying to return to a constitutional republic. We're called the fascists by the stooges of the fascists. People
That's
complain.
Exactly right.
People talk about America's becoming communist or Marxist. No, they're all the same. They're all, if you look at the political scale, the far left is 100% authoritarian power, and the far right is anarchy. Our goal is to be as close to anarchy and still maintain order. That's what the Constitution is all about.
Correct.
So fascism is a far left ideology. Communism is a far left ideology. To me, all the isms are just sales pieces. It's ways of marketing their authoritarianism, to the public.
Correct. And they place them purposely on opposite ends so they can herd the people into the middle. Because if you don't have a left and a right as they define it, not as we define it or as it's actually defined, because as you point out, they're all left, but they have to psychologically, in a psychological war, you have to frame it that it's a left and right issue so you can push people in the middle. Yeah, and in the middle is exactly where you don't want to be, because it's going to be you getting on the train cars for your own slaughter.
Yeah, and it's funny that you can try to simplify, or we've let them simplify human geopolitical interactions is a one-dimensional scale. It's probably at least
Correct.
2 dimensions. Yeah,
correct.
So I like the 2-dimensional version of this, and there's a couple of good graphics out there. I'll bring them next time we talk, and we can talk about that a little bit more. I always say left versus right is just a distraction to keep us from looking up and see who's really pulling the puppet strings.
Exactly. So, very well put.
Thank you. I've been coined that one a number of years back. So it's not just legally these legal treaties and stuff like that. There's all kinds of different mechanisms that these geopolitical players have tried to use. And the next one I want to talk about are the NACs. These are called natural asset companies. In a nutshell, what they are, they're basically a way of monetizing natural resources that have never been able to be monetized before. And the way they do that is you create a company out of thin air, get some investor money, and say, we're going to, basically be a corporation that invests in the water rights of Honduras, one of our favorite countries. Well, the people of Honduras didn't have a whole lot to say about it. I'm not going to go too deep into the NACs today because there's some good news. This idea was launched in 2021. There was a New York Stock Exchange was trying to or joined with some other groups, and I'll get into that in a second, to create something called the IEG, the Intrinsic Exchange Group, another great acronym. And the three main investors were the IDB, which is the Inter-American Development Bank, just another one of those MDBs, the New York Stock Exchange, and of course the Rockefeller Foundation. Go figure, they'd show up again. It was really geared towards the ESG investors, which, thank goodness, ESG is environmental social governance investing, which is huge. BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard were pushing these, and they were using the ESG scores to leverage corporate boards to do more quote unquote woke activities, diversity, sustainability, all that stuff under the guise of all their feel good things. The NACs actually got pulled, the bid, about 2 months ago. So all the public pressure on this has actually worked. So for whatever reason, we got a victory on that one. Witney Webb did a ton of really good homework on this when the idea first launched in 2021. So if you're interested in learning more, go check out Witney Webb's website, and I will post that in the notes of this video when I put it up.
She did an excellent job.
Yeah, she's done some good research, and I think she knows quite a bit about this stuff because she lives down in Central America, and so she's basically on the ground. Couple quotes about the NACs, what they were really trying to do. The New York Stock Exchange CEO is a guy by the name of Michael Blabrund, and he says, "Our hope is that owning a natural asset company is going to be a way that an increasingly broad range of investors have the ability to invest in something that's intrinsically valuable, but up to this point was really excluded from the financial markets." So they're basically trying to securitize every natural resource on the planet. And to give you an idea of how bold their plans are, if you were to add up all the investable assets in the world, you get about $500 trillion. If these NAC type investments were allowed to go forward, you're looking at something 800% bigger, a $4 quadrillion market. And it's basically investors owning all the natural resources around the world. So it's pretty insidious. How do they value it? They call it option value, the value of having the option to use or access a natural resource or ecosystem service now and in the future. And this includes the value for our ecosystem services not yet identified or quantified. Can you get more vague than that?
So what would you do if you're sitting on trillions of dollars of golden lily assets that you can't access? And how does that correlate to things like this?
I think the best way to answer that is to quote Klaus Schwab: "You will own nothing and be happy." That's really what they're trying to do. If you can securitize and using your own legal methodology and tell people, sorry, that's the land is no longer yours, the air you breathe is no longer yours. I can't think of a more insidious way of more insidious totalitarianism mechanism.
But I'm looking at it more from a perspective of, if you have all of this black market cash, for lack of a better word, is this a way in which to launder it into resources so that it's no longer considered black market?
No, 100%. Yeah, that's actually a really astute observation. How do you launder drug money? It's the same way that, what we're talking about, drug money. For those who don't know, she talked about Golden Lily. That was the gigantic stash of gold and precious resources that the United States seized from Japan at the end of World War II, and it was in the Philippines. And that money is being held in something called the Anderson Trust to this day. And MacArthur discovered all the gold stashes, flew back to D.C. Truman set up a commission. One of the guys was Anderson. Another one of the gentlemen was Lovett. Lovett. We're going to have to talk about the Golden Lily and Skull and Bones. That's got to be our next show. I've got a lot of research on that. I know you'll fill in a lot of color on it, but that's basically how the covert operations. All these people have been have created a self-funding mechanism to operations like Gladio all over the world. That's why they
Correct.
don't have. That's why Congress doesn't have the power of the purse string. So there really is no oversight. But like I said, the good news is the NACs got withdrawn. So there's all the pressure people put on them said that the New York Stock Exchange pulled the bid. So they'll come back. They'll come back in another form.
In another form.
Yeah, they're never going to stop. And I'm going to tell you about another one of those forms right now. There's an organization called GFANZ, GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Net zero, of course, is code speak for you'll own nothing and like it. These people love their acronyms. This is launched in 2021 by John Kerry, the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change, Janet Yellen, who's the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury and former chair of the Federal Reserve, and of course, Mark Carney, and he is the United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, and he's the former chair of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada. So you got some pretty big players. The people behind it, they've got they create some subsectors. They call the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. You have the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. My favorite is the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And to tell you how big these, Net Zero Banking Alliance actually controls 43% of all global banking assets. So put that into perspective. These are the biggest and most powerful banks in the world. And they're creating this what are they trying to do to get net zero? They could care less about about net zero or carbon or anything like that. That's just, they're hiding under the guise of environmentalism to allow these corporations to take over your resources. I think it's kind of fun to talk about who the top players in GFANZ are at this meeting in 2021 that just happened. You can guess a few of the banks. It's BlackRock, Citibank, my former employer, Bank of America, Banco Santander, the great money laundering bank, HSBC, and of course, and of course, the David Rockefeller Fund. How many times have I said all roads lead to the Rockefellers? And again, these people are talking about stakeholder capitalism. Again, stakeholder capitalism is ridiculous. When you're a shareholder, when you buy stock in a company, one of the things that comes with that, you're taking on risk with your own capital, so you get some, you have some rights, and one of those is to vote for the company's vote your shares in the company's decisions. Well, stakeholder capitalism basically says, well, the people who live around your plant or whatever, they also have those rights, even though they've got no skin in the game. And it's ridiculous. It's illegal. I wish Jefferson had stuck with John Locke's life, liberty, and property instead of pursuit of happiness. They could have added property. It could have been life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. Because if that were the case, selling people on stakeholder capitalism would have been a lot more difficult. And we could have codified property rights, which is at the very essence of individual liberty. So
Correct.
this goes near and dear to my heart. Of course, what happens if a nation goes against these policies? They get taken out by the U.S. military or the CIA in a Gladio type operation.
Well, that's kind of where we started, right? Because it's the same thing of why they use all of these instruments.
I'm going to close up with one other observation. On September 10th, 2001, which is the day before an event we may have all heard of called 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld gives a speech on how the Department of Defense needed to become privatized. And now we live in a world where military, borders, prisons, all that's been privatized for profit. But there's apparently there's a report out in 2007 and 2008 that in Iraq and Afghanistan wars, there are actually more private contractors working for the Department of Defense than there were enlisted personnel.
That's true.
Yeah. Well, you knew you were there. You were enlisted at the time. In many countries, private security outnumbers the police and they're better armed. And one of the reasons they do this is because you cannot send a FOIA request to private companies, but you can do that to government entities. So it's a lot easier to hide the atrocities. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about with the privatization, and the securitization of all these things. It's all part of the same overall big picture?
So let me tie my end up. In every entity from the beginning of whether it's the CIA or the military from 1947, which created both the CIA and the first ever standing army in the United States. So it was those exact same dates that they began instituting the privatization of a entity within an entity. So they set up the CIA, but within the CIA is its own private CIA, and it's done in a privatized manner with former agents. So in every case, and that's basically how you got to Operation Gladio, is it is not within the paychecks and control, as you pointed out, of Congress. They are citizen paramilitary entities being controlled under the auspices of the CIA. So they have a CIA within a CIA. And it's referred to basically as Operation Gladio type activities. The same is true with the military. If you go back to the 1980s, when the conversion began of basically privatizing, we were supposedly in this austere condition, even though we had more money than we had ever had before in the Department of Defense, in having to contract out, little things like who mows the yard, or who was fixing the electrical systems on a military installation. So we started there. And now we're contracting out entire capabilities to include airlines, shipping, and every other aspect of the military under this privatization. So we now have a military within a military. What you will find very interesting, and I stumbled across this in my Operation Gladio in Southeast Asia, is I was unaware that the extent to which our university systems police what's framed as academic programs, has taken an international policing role in all of these areas that are that has had Operation Gladio activity. So if you go to Vietnam specifically, the Phoenix program, which was nothing more than a glorified, massive fascist police state, it was ran by the Michigan State University. The cops there were trained. They did the same thing in Thailand. And it's not just Michigan State, it's all of them. So these same people are the ones, if you go to our police academies that are training our police force, where you almost have a paramilitary capability within the police, and they belong to secret societies, and most of the people do not realize that that element of our policing exists here in the United States as well.
A couple things to add to that. You mentioned those the 1947 events. Right there in that post-World War II period is when we created entities like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. All these NGOs, and it was a brilliant plan. It's been executed, but they always have to have a boogeyman as their excuse for taking on more draconian power or centralized power. First of all, it was the communist fear, the domino effect in Central America. Cold War ended, and so we had to have the war on terror. Now everything's about the climate crisis. This is what they use as a justification for consolidating their power.
Correct.
I had the other thought you talked about, the secret societies, and I can't let that pass without pointing out that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the US FBI, was founded by a bunch of Scottish Rite Freemasons, and that is definitely tied into some of the most insidious sides of Freemasonry, and they've been responsible for quite a few atrocities over the last couple of centuries, pretty much since Pope. Was it Pope or Pike? Pipe. Forget his last name, in the 1800s. Pike. Yeah. Founded the Scottish Rites, or his chapter of that. But let me pass the baton, because you were going to bring this home with some pretty interesting commentary of what's going on today.
You blew my mind. Where were we going with this?
We were talking about we're going into technology.
Oh, correct. Okay, so let me just point out the framework of what we're talking about. We first discussed Warhamster and I's first video together was the kinetic version of Operation Gladio and how they basically have used it to coup governments over 70 different times and the terror bombings, assassinations, blah, blah, blah. So there's a kinetic version of it. He just described to you the economic and legal way in which they affect basically taking over entire governments or destroying entire countries based on weaponizing legal and economic warfare as well. And if you haven't seen Tucker's last video with Mike Benz, Benz, I highly encourage you to go do that, because if you have sat through our series of interviews, you will understand immediately that Mike is talking about the 21st century version of fifth generation warfare, 5GW, cyber Gladio operations, because what he is describing is the CIA and the NATO and other intel agencies, the BND in Germany, Mossad. It's not isolated to just the CIA, MI6. They have weaponized cyber to effect the exact same thing that Gladio does kinetically. So obviously, kinetic operations are messy, right? So you just saw the guy over in Russia get knocked off.
Navalny.
Now, my take on that whole thing is, if Putin wanted that guy dead, he'd have been dead the day he was caught. He is on tape, people in his group on tape, as part of a fascist network that was trying to work with the West to coup Putin. That's just, there's videos of it out there already. So he also worked with Dugin. Dugin is a fascist. If you go back and you look, and they all try to tell us that he's Putin's friend. He is not Putin's friend. He has written some horrific racist, fascist garbage. And he's the one whose daughter got blown up. So if Putin wanted the guy dead, he'd be dead. He's been in prison for 3 years. He goes for a walk and he's murdered. So he happens to be murdered at the exact same time Congress says they're not going to fund Ukraine. So how else do you institute the momentum? Because we've been tricked before. That's the whole reason of 9/11. If you're not going to fund your own security state, we're just going to kill a bunch of you in order to get you to fund your own security state, which is exactly what we did. They know how we operate, and they know how they've tricked us in the past. Their problem now is they don't own all of the media. And there's enough people out there reporting the truth fast enough that people are not getting caught up in their psyops games anymore. So
Yeah.
Mike did an excellent job of talking about the cyber control, because they've lost control of the media. They can't lose control of the media. And his point is that they are using cyber to control us on the internet in order to reinstitute their Mockingbird media capability.
Yeah, and this is why, and you said you had a couple of really important points about the control of the media. I call what we're living through right now Gutenberg 2.0, where all of a sudden these central powers lost control of the means of communication. For during the 20th century, they had monopolistic control over what we read in the news, whether it be via newspapers, were owned by a handful of corporations.
Right.
They obviously had a monopoly from day one on radio and television, but they've lost control of the internet, and that's what scares them. That's why there's so much pushback, or so much push for what they call disinformation and misinformation panels to limit,
Yeah.
to censor what we can do. The court case of Missouri versus Biden is still ongoing, and they've been exposed. In the news this week was the fact that the U.S. State Department is trying really hard to avoid FOIA requests to talk about how they were trying to set up misinformation bureaus. And I think it's very important. And the other point I wanted to make is, if you read the Western media, they're going to tell you that Putin assassinated his political opposition, Navalny. Well, in November of 2023, just a few months ago, Putin was polling at 83% in his own country. He does not have political opposition. They basically have single party rule there, and it appears to be relatively popular in Russia, but they do need their Ukraine funding, and they're going to, you also had that emergency meeting that called by Congress for this big briefing that Russia now has space capabilities. I'd like to do a quick blast from the past, going back a decade. Where did Russia get that technology of the hypersonic missiles?
Kokovo or
Skolkovo. Yeah.
Hillary Clinton.
For those who don't, exactly. So for those who don't know, in 2010 through 2012, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were going around spouting their Russian reset. Yeah, the big Russian reset. And what that was, they created a Russian Silicon Valley called Skolkovo. And that's where a bunch of American corporations worked with, Russian, I guess, state entities to on a bunch of technology transfers. It was really interesting because 17 of those 28 companies doing that were donors to the Clinton Foundation. Go figure how they get in there. And the lid got blown on that because a Department of Defense issued a report, and they were very worried that we're giving away too many military trade secrets to Russia. Fast forward 10 years later. And
so let me just say, when the fall of the Soviet Union happens and you lose your favorite boogeyman, when they fall too far behind, you do Skolkovo so that you can ante up some competition and share with them so that they can reemerge as your new competition.
And how many times have you and I both been called a Putin puppet for telling the truth about this stuff on social media?
Yeah. I think repeatedly.
How much is Putin paying you this year? I didn't re-up my own contract, so.
Yeah, I mean, just telling the truth for the people who want to hide the truth, which is, to me, all that means. If your response to my facts is I'm a puppet, what does that make you?
Yeah, well, if your argument leads with an insult or any kind of it means you don't trust the value of your own arguments. That's always been the case. But unfortunately, one of the wild west of social media, you got more people with opinions than have the ability to do deductive reasoning or logic. But it's all right. We get through to some of them.
Yes.
Continue with the Mike Benz interview, because I think
that's basically kind of it in a nutshell. I just wanted everybody to understand from a context perspective that when you first listen to that, it's shocking. The CIA is doing this. The NATO is doing this. When you realize this is just the electronic version of what they've been doing since 1947, it puts it into context for you that while they are doing everything he says, and it is who he says is doing it, it is nothing new. It is the modern day version of what they have always done. And in some respects, I guess, if it from their perspective, it's better than going out and shooting a bunch of people, but it always ends up at that point, which we just learned with Russia, right? So there's only so much censorship that they can do without having to let a few bullets fly around in order to co-opt their entire control network. So I just didn't want anybody to think that he does a great job. Don't get me wrong. He spent years and years and years of exposing this, which is exactly what happened with all of these authors that I've written about Gladio. Gladio has been the last 25 years of exposure. Even before that, 35 years of exposure. And we still never have heard about it in the West. Right. So, in the US, they've heard it all over Europe. So at the same time, again, the timing of all of this revelation is just miraculous to me, because at the same time, I've been jumping up and down screaming about Gladio and how it's been here for the last 35 years in full knowledge of everybody except for America. That this comes out, Tucker's interview with Putin comes out, and for the first time ever, Jack Posobiec actually uttered the words Operation Gladio after our first Spaces meeting. So all of this has, in a very short window of time, began massive exposure. And I just wanted to tie that piece in with the existing Operation Gladio material that we've presented.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's one thing to expose this stuff, but the question is, how do we, as a free people that love our individual liberty, what do we do to fight back against that? And
You just already told them. You said that we won the natural resources. That's exactly how did that get won? It got it won because of exposure, and getting the information out there is how we win.
yeah, sunlight's the ultimate cleanser. That first. And you have to do it. And this stuff is not just happening on an international level. They're using the same mechanisms and levers of power locally. You can see that anywhere in the United States when you start looking at these Agenda 21 um, rules and regulations and development of your local municipality, and you can fight back against that locally. You can go to the school board meetings, but at the end of the day, there's two competing forces: those of us who want to be self-governed and those who want to govern us. And that's really what the American Revolution was fought about: is people, we wanted self-determination and individual liberty, and the central government, those who want to rule over us, top-down rule, have been incrementally taking away those individual freedoms ever since.
Good
And
news.
that's where the solution lies: is to rediscover, again, getting people to understand, why this country was founded, why it was such a threat to the interests of empire. And that's what the United States has become. We've become an empire, and we were never intended to be that. We're supposed to be a union of sovereign states. And
Correct.
if we can, and that's where we solve that. And where America goes, the rest of the world's going to follow. I know China and Russia are trying very hard to get away from the monopolar dollar hegemon, as they should. And I'll drop in one last little bit about Putin and let you respond to that. Putin's foreign policy has been governed by something called the Primakov Doctrine, which was written in the late 1990s. And it's out there on the internet. Look up Primakov, Primakov Doctrine. And Primakov talked about how if Russia is going to survive as a sovereign nation, they needed to they had three pillars. And the most important one was to remove Russia from this global financial system, the dollar hegemony. And that appears to be happening. The American sanctions against Russia appear to have backfired. Russia's economy is growing. The ruble is stronger than it's been in ages. And, we've got all kinds of problems with the dollar. That's why they're going to try to throw a global digital currency down our throats. But that's a whole show unto itself. But so Putin's actions they're laid out. This is, he's always tried to get Russia to become independent. And he's going to bring a lot of the eastern part of the world along with him. And I think that may end up being a good thing for everybody, because I think currency competition forces governments to act honestly. Tax competition forces, if you don't like the tax in your state, you move someplace else.
Well, he actually said in his Tucker interview, that wasn't necessarily his first choice. He wanted to join in with, not necessarily be a member of NATO, but he wanted to work with NATO because those are the exact same people that the Soviet Union had fought with. He didn't have anything against any of them. They wouldn't let him in. They forced him into his current doctrine.
Yeah, well, you think maybe adding 14 formerly Eastern European bloc countries since 1991 might have had anything to do with that?
Like I said, they forced him into his current doctrine.
Yeah. And that's what we said earlier. They always need a boogeyman.
Correct.
That's how you justify the spending. Yeah, and
Correct.
the Constitution never authorized a standing army. It had to be reauthorized every 2 years by Congress. But yet we have standing armies, and we were never supposed to have troops stationed all over the world. You want to talk about a national debt? Well, why don't we stop? Why don't we get out of the business of empire? Now, what's interesting is the Constitution did authorize a permanent navy, and they did that because they understood how important international trade was for the good of everybody, for the economic good. And there's a big difference between the Army and the Navy in terms of their statutory rights to exist or be permanent.
You have no idea. I served with them all. There could not be more difference.
Well, let's wrap up. We're right at about an hour. I think we've covered the topic pretty well.
So I would just say that I encourage everybody to do their own reading, do their own research on Operation Gladio. There seems like a never-ending well of information. I will plug this Monday. We're going to, at 6 o'clock on the pond, on Spaces on X, we are going to do a deep dive into a sub-element of Operation Gladio called Operation Condor, which specifically talks about some of the things we were just talking about as they relate specifically to South America and Latin America, where our government and NATO, weirdly enough, has went all over South America using Gladio trained assets to overthrow governments down there. And we're going to talk a little bit about why they did each country, how they did each country, and what was the effect of the overthrow.
Where can people watch that if they want to?
It's on X's, or it's on X on a space at 6 p.m. called The Pond.
And
so
what
when
is
you're
it?
on, go ahead.
And you'll post the link to it on your Twitter
I
Twitter
do.
handle.
Yeah.
So tell everyone where to find you on Twitter.
So I'm on two different addresses, either at Colonel Towner, COLTOWNER, or at Colonel Watkins, COLWATKINS, at True Social and Twitter. I'm also on Substack, and I'm also on Rumble. We do book reviews. I will tell you, I'll plug this. This is the book we're doing right now. This is the Skorzeny Papers. Skorzeny was a Gladio. He was in the original werewolf section of World War II that General Galen created, the werewolf units, which transitioned into Operation Gladio. This major, he's a retired Air Force major that wrote this book. He actually bought Skorzeny's papers from his child. They went on auction. This major bought him, and he wrote this book. He is also creating a mobile museum that he's going to take on the road in the next few months, which, of course, I told him he's welcome here when he comes to Central Florida. But I tracked this major down because I was so wanting to talk to somebody who knew more about Operation Gladio than I did, and this guy definitely does. He is an amazing man. What he did and the research that he did to create this book. So we're currently reviewing this book on my Rumble channel, The Colonel's Corner. And our next one is going to be Gold Warriors, which is one of your favorite topics. This is our next book. We've already announced it so people can get it and read along. So we're very excited about that.
Very good. Yeah, and I've heard a couple. I've listened to a couple of your episodes of the Skorzeny stuff, and it's pretty compelling if you're into this topic. She gives a pretty good deep dive and gives some really good color. You can find me. My main channel on Rumble is war_hamster. If you're watching this video, you're probably already there. My Twitter handle is war_hamster1776. That's at war_hamster. Make sure you get the spelling right, because there's a few other hamsters running around the internet. On True Social, I'm at war_hamster. And you can usually find me commenting on patriots.win, which was formerly The Donald, before it got shut down in the censorship scheme right after January 6th. Very good. This has been fun. It's been a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to our next episode. I really would like to do Skull and Bones. I got a bunch of really good research because it ties into the same stuff. And
it does. Let me just tell you that I don't think it's all that far-fetched. If you look up the bone face and how their image looks, they're modern day Nazis in the United States. That emblem, the symmetry of this entire thing is just crazy connected.
Yeah, and I've always said, I've always connected the Skull and Bones image to pirates. And
Yes.
If you really look at these people who run the world today, they are modern day pirates. And as I always love to point out, the difference between a pirate and a privateer is a piece of paper. And that's exactly what we talked about today with these investor dispute settlements, is they've legalized piracy.
So you also know 6 generations ago from Bush Sr., his great, however many greats grandfather was a slave captain, pirate, right? And they mutinied him at sea.
All right, let's save that one for the next episode.
That's our teaser.
That's it is. Thanks, everyone. Let's give it a wrap. Everybody have a great week. And I apologize, I will not be able to join your spaces. I will be on an airplane headed back to San Diego. But I will. I wish you could. I wish those were easier to find on recordings.
There are recordings, and I'll send it to you when it's available.
Fantastic, and I'll get this video over to you shortly.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching. Cheers.
Bye.